Welcome to episode 70 of Nutanix Weekly. I'm your host, Phil Sellers. I am a solutions architect here at XenTegra, and I'm happy to have two great Nutanix resources on the line with me today. I've got Jirah Cox, and I've also got Ben Rogers. Ben, Jirah, how are you guys doing today?
Good, thanks, Philip.
I'm doing great, Philip. Appreciate it.
So, Ben, you were just telling us before we started, you're just getting back off of vacation. You've been out on the North Carolina Outer Banks and pretty remote. I imagine pretty too.
Oh my God, it's being a native from North Carolina. When you get out that far, it's hard to believe you're in the same state. It literally it has a very tropical island feel to it, but great time, man. Did a lot of stargazing, did a lot of cool things with my stepdaughter, and so with my granddaughter. So, man, just really a good time. So glad to be back. Glad to have the time off, and looking forward to seeing what the future brings, my friend.
That's awesome. Yeah, Jirah, long time no see. I got to spend some time with Jirah in person last week. He was able to join us for our mid-year company connect, and it was great seeing you last week.
Great to see you. Great to see the whole XenTegra community. Man, super impressive.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Jirah did a great presentation for our team. We're always learning when we get together, so it's great to have partners that build into us. And Jirah's always a great resource to help us that way. So today's podcast episode, we're talking about some new things going on inside of object storage from Nutanix. So I don't want to steal Jirah's thunder, but Jirah, you brought this one to us. You want to lead off with a little bit of the news here?
Yeah, man, certainly not my thunder to steal, but definitely a super exciting announcement coming out with our Objects 4.0 release, which is out now. And full credit to Steve McElfatrick. So that's who wrote this. He's one of our tech marketing engineers, which, if you don't know, our TME team, that's like 90% marketing. 90% technical, 10% marketing. Dang it, I got that backwards. I was trying not to get that backwards. Emphasis on the technical there, with a little bit of marketing sprinkled on. So the team's fantastic, start to finish. But Steve's a real joy. He's one of our global object specialists. Which is fitting because this release brings global namespaces, right? So we can now take Nutanix objects, right, like our S3 on-prem, data in buckets as a web technology type of offering, and now unify that globally, right? So you can have a global namespace. This has been a long time ask from our major customers to say, hey, this is cool that I can have a Raleigh or a Charlotte or a Seattle deployment for this, but I'm a global company, right? How do I really go big with this technology? And this is how we get there.
So, Jirah, I have to ask, is this for technologists that have been in, infrastructure for a long time? Sometimes object storage can be a little confusing. So is this sort of like DFS namespace inside of a Windows AD network? Is it similar to that?
Man, that's interesting. That takes me back because I was thinking about some other ways to talk about this. As we get into this and some analogies to bring, I was actually going to talk about DNS and domains versus like forests. And I think both are totally applicable, right? It's like there are resources that I want to consume and maybe even control locally, but also access globally, right? Or able to access a second copy of them elsewhere, right? So I think both those analogies really kind of come through for sure. Like DFS, yeah, for SMB, right? As a collection of like SMB stores that may or may not have the same contents. And yeah, this is a similar construct of global namespaces for object stores that may or may not store the same contents.
Awesome. So the introduction here, it talks a little bit about federation. And you mentioned this is new in Objects 4.0. So from a versioning standpoint, is that tied to a particular AOS release? Is that a particular version that we have to be at, or how independent, I guess, is the Nutanix objects from?
Yeah, without memorizing the compatibility matrices, I think it's mostly independent from AOS, from Prism Element for sure. Objects does run within Prism Central. That'd be the only thing, right? So you're probably on the latest Prism Central for almost all customers because that's the multi-cluster management construct. And so there's always goodness coming to that Prism Central release, and that usually gets you on the right path to run the latest Objects release as well.
Ben, as you're talking with customers and stuff, how many conversations are you having kind of around Nutanix Objects? I mean, what are customers talking to you about?
Well, they're talking, what's really interesting about it is customers are wanting to look for ways to consolidate their object storage, especially when they're looking at cloud services, multiple cloud services. And so this is a really good talking point for us because we can consolidate all that for them in one platform, and we can extend that from on-prem, which is where their traditional footprint is, out to their new cloud footprints and really make it look the same across the environment. So we're having this conversation. I will be the first to admit that I'm coming up to speed on this technology. I know, man, we've done a lot within US in the last 6 months. So I'm a little bit more on the customer side of this, where I'm looking at somebody like Jirah going, educate me. How can I utilize this in my environment, and what is the best way for me to take advantage of this? So again, the DFS, comparison was good for me because I did run that, but I'm a little more curious of, okay, I've got a global environment, I'm spread out across my environment. How do I ensure that, things are going to drop where they need to go if I implement this federation format, but yet I still need my silos for geographic regions, if you would say?
That's a great question, right? So let's go. This article takes this for granted and skips over it. So let's go deeper off script here. But like, why would I use this, right? So the two big use cases, right, that we're seeing for object storage are primarily backup storage, and then sort of next gen cloud native application storage. And we can get into both of those. For backups, right, that's where we're helping customers move off stuff like basically traditional backup appliances, where ultimately it was just a big piece of sheet metal, maybe with some disk shelves attached, but ultimately it was offering like an SMB share out to the network. And then, backup applications were simply writing to that share. And it was a giant, big, almost like a storage array, but maybe even sometimes single controller, big pile of data, right? And that's fine. Often that's a price per pound kind of use case, right? It's cheap and deep. And that's all fine as well. But the biggest sort of management pain came in with the life cycling of that, right? Like, how big can I get? If I want to cross a certain threshold, how do I go and scale beyond that? Even if I don't scale in 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, so whatever my financial schedule is, how do I get off of that, go on the next one, right? And sometimes there's answers for that. Sometimes there's services for that. Sometimes there's replication tools for that. But typically that refresh was at least some amount of pain or management or hassle or distraction from running the business. With Nutanix, right, we now, of course, we can also still do SMB shares, but really the next gen web scale way to think about backup targets is with S3, right, as the protocol, right, for storing backup data in object stores. This is where, look at a lot of your vendors, right, like your Rubrik, your Cohesity, it's now natively in Veeam, it's in Commvault. Even if you have some local storage, maybe your last 30 days, it's sort of becoming just broadly accepted that long-term storage goes outside of that SMB, or I'll say appliance managed storage, and gets pushed out to S3. It's sort of always assumed to be the cheapest of the cheap, the deepest of the deep. And also when you get there, you get fun capabilities, right? Stuff like Worm, right? Stuff like archive retention lock, so that I get even more protection as a business against like accidental deletion or even malicious deletion. So then I get even more of a security blanket wrapped around my backup storage, and that's awesome. Should be moving in theory to a lower price per gig as well. So that is a win on the financial side. But then the sort of Nutanix yes and to all of that is the life cycling, right? So you could deploy like a petabyte, archive today running in S3, run that for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. The hardware itself has lived its life. It's time to leave the data center, bring in new hardware. Maybe it's twice as big, right? Maybe now I have twice as much capacity. This is where that Nutanix difference really applies. I bring in the new nodes, put them in the data center, expand that cluster to now bridge the old and the new hardware, eject those old nodes, and I've done zero tuning, revisiting, reswizzling, migration, nothing, right? The application that is writing to it, your Veeam, your Rubrik, Cohesity, whatever, Commvault doesn't even know that I made a change, but I just replatform that entire ball of data without having to do any real work.
And that to me makes it feel like, at a platform standpoint, you've got those capabilities, but now you've brought that global namespace to it as well. So now you've got, this object store, which can live forever, can be upgraded, can change its performance characteristics, and I don't have to update a single pointer or anything. I've effectively got the same place to write forever and ever. Amen.
Yeah, right. So this new feature probably has use case for backup and archive use cases as well, but it is much more, in my mind, aligned with like a cloud storage for applications kind of use case, right? So if I'm putting out an application, whether that's internal or external, doesn't matter. S3 is an authenticated protocol that can go inside the firewall, outside the firewall. Either one's fine there. If I'm putting out an app or I'm distributing data internally, I had one customer who was distributing these 3D assets, right, to all their various global offices, where they wanted to sort of like compile, render them in one place, and then consume them in a bunch of places. With this kind of access now, we can have a solution. It's basically like an on-prem CDN, where I can put them in one location, replicate them to a bunch of other locations, and all those locations can pull them down locally, right, saving on WAN bandwidth, increasing performance, increasing speed. But if their local one was down for some reason, they can also get elsewhere to retrieve that same data where it's stored elsewhere. That's why I say it's sort of like on-prem CDN, content delivery network type of outcome that we can now offer as one global federation or multiple federations even, right? So I can have, a whole bunch of, I can have 30 offices, right? And say some are my, accounting federation, some are my, development federation, right? And I could have those all different and managed within Nutanix.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And as I think about cloud native applications, coming from an organization that was trying to move into more microservice and cloud-based technologies, one of the things we were thinking about was, pods of our application all around different geographies. And this seems like a huge enabler as we adopt S3 type buckets in the application to now then have that data transport with us to each of those regions too.
Totally. I can think of a lot of use cases for like edge sites. I mean, edge sites, of course, still need backup, but they might even do like local video storage or whatnot. And I can then use that to replicate like many to one. Maybe I bring a bunch of remote sites back to one HQ data center grade site, but then I make them all look like one giant happy data storage, family through a federation as well. So it's really, really pretty cool.
So I can think of a customer that we've been talking to that this will hit the mark right off the bat. They're running manufacturing, but each plant does different manufacturing, and they have to have different logos as part of their packaging for that factory. But they want to have a unified space. Well, this will do exactly what you're saying. They can have everything pretty much housed in the data center, and then the pieces they need to have on the edge, they can either replicate those out or whatever technology. But when you're looking at their tree, it'll all be, company XYZ, and then they'll have different locations, and those locations will have the specific artwork and everything that they need for that manufacturing facility. So this is going to be great for that process, because now I can go back and go, guys, we can make it look like all one tree. It can be, company XYZ, and then under company XYZ, we can then replicate portions of this out to the edge that you need and still have centralized storage back in the data center. So really cool, man. I look forward to having that conversation with our customer.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. Actually, I can picture some even automated site deployments, right? Where I just pick is this going to be a red site or a blue site? And I can deploy it, automate the full stack, and then know that it's going to get access to that same data set even immediately, right? But then also replicating over time so it gets even more locality and caches closer to where the work is going to happen.
And then I think it's cool what you mentioned, Jirah, which goes back to the just basic goodness of Nutanix, the ability to inject and eject nodes as the environment needs to grow, upgrade, all of those things. You really do forget when you talk about a service like this that, man, it's built back on that platform and foundation that we're always talking about, the ease of use, flexibility, simplicity.
Yeah, it's the enabling factor here. And I think that's the underscore is, as it develops, as Nutanix develops this platform, I mean, it's built on that enabling core technology. So I do want to spend some time kind of peeling the onion a little bit, and talk about how we get into this architecture, this federation. The next section of the blog post goes into it a little bit more, but Jirah, can you explain a little bit from an architectural standpoint?
Yeah, totally. So, and there's a button, and there's even a neat, if you're more visual learner than like auditory, you can watch this all in a quick little YouTube video on our YouTube channel as well. But when you go to create a new object store federation, right, then you get prompted to say, well, what should be inside of it? And so then that's simply a matter of picking. You can do as few as one, but really, like, I think 3 is recommended for sort of geodiversity and resiliency. Pick 3 different object stores, right, that then serve as like core members, right? And we call them core members because that's where they're going to store some additional data that really is like metadata of like what is the federation shaped like and who else is in it. And of course, we like, if you've seen our cluster minimums, right, we like to do like minimum 3 of something so that we can still lose something and still have full continuity as well. So 3 is a good starting point for scale out systems, and we see that here as well. So there's sort of 2 components to it, right? There's the metadata service, which is really tracking like who is storing what data and where, and what is the shape and size of a given federation. And then also, more importantly, there's controllers, right? So to think back to like our DFS analogy, sort of, DFS could be like, I can go to a server and query, like, where's this file share? And the answer could be it's here or it's over there, but I get the sort of traffic cop effect of I'm directed to where the resource I want to get to is located. Same thing here, right? So the federation controller knows what lives where, and then depending on whether I want to do, a discovery action or actually like a CRUD, like create, rename, update, delete action, it'll tell me where to go to get to make sure that happens.
That makes sense. Again, yeah, I mean, high resiliency, high availability, built into the product, thought out from the beginning. So it sounds like it's enterprise ready from the beginning, which is another Nutanix tenet. I mean, as you talk about the commonality between, things like your core number of Nutanix DSF nodes, files nodes, in the multiples of 3. Yeah, I mean, it makes total sense.
Yeah. One thing you'll see here from the beginning, right, is it's built to be cross Prism Central, right? So no need for this all to live in one Prism Central. In fact, the opposite, since Prism Central usually is let's call it a regional or availability zone construct, it's actually expected that you're probably going to cross that probably from day one. So you can have these object stores that are all federating together across multiple Prism Centrals, and that's expected and even encouraged.
Yeah, that's important to call out. I noticed that in the diagram, but it's even more important to point out, because we typically think of Prism Central as that roll-up point, but this is bridging across those. So the relationship to availability zones also kind of called out here. Can you tell us a little more about that relationship to the availability zones and kind of how to think about it?
Totally, right. So and even it highlights here in the article that when you do that multi-PC deployment, one cool thing it does is that, of course, in the construct of object storage, right, in the S3 protocol, the access keys are actually sort of generated by the cluster owning the data, right? So like you're Philip, I'm Jirah, he's Ben. Our usernames don't matter whatsoever to the data, right? The object store really generates the access keys, both the random string of numbers and letters that is, quote, the username, and also the password, right? That's all just sort of dictated by the object store. But the cool thing is that when you configure this replication, we reference it here as the IAM replication actually handles all that as well. So that means now my keys can go anywhere to any object store, even though they were created at the Raleigh object store. I can use them in Charlotte or Seattle or Tokyo or anywhere else. Those access keys now are, what's the right word here? They can be granted access to objects and resources elsewhere, even though my keys might live in a different, or created in a different store.
Then you're gonna have to watch out. I've got your keys now, so might come after your car.
So I was wondering about this again. I'm looking at this from the customer point of view. So what you're telling me is that if I've got multiple object stores out there that are being managed by multiple Prism Centrals, we now have a way to kind of bind all those Prism Centrals and stores under one federation.
Yeah, for the 100% for the object side of it, right? The S3 part of it. We've always had solutions for like VMs and file shares for like SMB, all that good stuff. This one's now with respect to the objects protocol, right? The S3 protocol. Yeah, those keys that you generated in any one of those sites can now gain portability in that federation to go anywhere to any other object store, which isn't explicitly granting access, but now they are grantable. Right. So basically, continue using our DFS analogy, which at some point, if you really know S3, you probably are rolling your eyes at us. But if you don't, this is probably helping. Right, with that DFS federation right now, my username and password for one file server now works at the other one if I'm in the ACLs for that one.
So super important we have to be able to see what's going on inside of it. So Nutanix thought about that. So we've got new views inside of Prism Central for federated namespaces as well. The article goes in, we've got a nice screenshot, and I know a picture's worth 1,000 words. So you can find the link in the description for the podcast. But Jirah, I mean, what's important for us to know and see in terms of object stores and watching and scaling out?
If I think about this from like if I had to run this environment, right, what do I care about the most? And you're right, it's on this week's edition of Let's Describe to You a Screenshot in Words, right? What object stores have I created, right? Where are they located? How big are they, right? How much data am I storing in each one? That's super important. How do I get there, right? So all of them have, of course, local IP addresses per site for accessing, and we'll come back to IPs and accessing that way later on. And probably also the last thing I want to know in a Nutanix parlance is like which PC is managing them, right? Like sort of which also sort of touches on which availability zone are they a member of. So which is usually often regional or like a continent perhaps.
And so, I think we may take it for granted, but there's object stores and then there's buckets. And so a little bit of the screenshot here deals with the number of buckets that we've got and how many objects are in things. So for someone approaching object store new, I mean, how do you describe the difference between an object store, an object, and buckets?
Someone could do a better job of this, but I would think it's a fair analogy to say that you can think of an object store kind of like a file server and a bucket like a share, right? So it is a container, possibly one of several, right? Probably one of several on the logical object.
And then an object would be analogous to a file, for instance.
Right. And then, of course, the buckets that then hold the objects themselves, which is the data you're storing, right? Whether that is, if you are running a social media site, right? Every time someone uploads a new avatar or attaches a picture to a post, all those things are probably going to land somewhere on some flavor of S3 storage on the back end.
Yeah. So hopefully no one punches us for that analogy, but I think it's helpful for infrastructure folks who've approached a different kind of a problem in the past. The next section really talks us through how clients requests or accesses. I'm not sure that was English. Let me back that up and try it again. How client requests are routed. I don't know what I said the first time.
And we probably don't have to step through the data path like call by call. We should point out we didn't even say this is on the Nutanix developer blog, which is really cool. These are kind of more technical posts in nature. We sort of pick and choose as we feed the blog engine right around the corporate Nutanix blog on Nutanix.com, the developer blog on Nutanix.dev, which is where we are today, and also the community blog as well, where we've seen some great stuff about Nutanix on, say, OVH, or some folks that have put together some great blog posts out of their home labs. So we have a wonderful place, a number of places we can pull from. Today we're on the dev site. So there is a couple of very highly detailed paragraphs here around how do calls work. I think for podcast level specificity, we can just say, guess what, it works. There are a couple of actions that are more important that do get routed through those core members. When I need to do stuff like, I don't know, to use some more terrible analogies, right? The S3 equivalent of like looking up a phone number in a phone book, But then when I make that phone call, it can be either local. Kids, we used to have these things called phone books. They were printed out. But when I make the phone call, right, that might be local, might be remote, but my conversation gets where it needs to either do the put or the get request to either place or retrieve new data.
And I think that's important too. So, I mean, as you think about S3 as a protocol, it's a little different. It's more like what you get with HTTP calls from a web browser, as opposed to, your traditional SMB. So you've got get and put, which are the same verbs you have from a web browser, same thing that you would do with any API. So, definitely very much cloud native technology. Yeah, I was looking through these steps, and I was happy to hear you say, let's don't go step by step, because our point's not to put people to sleep on the podcast.
If you were tuning in today to listen to the step-by-step handshake of how does my S3 request get looked up and then honored, I'm so sorry to be disappointing you. But we do want you to stay awake and not crash in traffic. But it's a great point, Philip. So because it's web native technology, right, now we get to bring in really cool stuff that we sort of never had back in, to stick with the analogy, back in like the DFS days of like, how do I put a load balancer in front of this? How do I do geo routing with that conversation around the load balancer, right? Like if I work in the Budapest office, I want to retrieve data as closely to where I'm sitting as possible, right? Maybe that's somewhere local or in a neighboring country, but not like have to go across the world to pick something up if it is closer. So with GSLB, which is kind of I think vendor agnostic term, global service load balancing? I know 3 of the 4 letters.
I think it's global server load balancing.
Thank you, Ben. So basically, it's a way for using basically some health monitoring, DNS trickery, some perhaps weighting of records that I can put in as the admin. I can say, when you ask where something is, if it's close to you, we'll send you somewhere close to you. But if that's down or unreachable or having a bad day or whatever, we'll go somewhere else so that you still get your request honored. Maybe not as close as ideally, right? But it's sort of a way of adding some awareness of data health and integrity to the conversation. So with this now, we can do fun stuff like when I want to retrieve a 3D asset, right? Maybe from this bucket on my on-prem, CDN, or restore from a backup, right? From my backup now Federation Cloud in privately. I can now get that from the closest location where it's available, or somewhere farther away if it's not replicated locally close to me. Similarly, when I want to do a data write, right? Maybe if I'm one of these artists generating 3D assets, I might have 3 offices around the world where I can do the put, right? The save action, and that'll get replicated to 30 other offices that can all do the retrieval, right? I can set up that replication in lots of fun ways. So because it's a web native technology, load balancers eat this for breakfast, right? They can do it very, very capably right from the get-go.
The next thing, if I'm a customer who already has Object Store and is thinking about federation and hey, this really, really meets my use case, what happens to my local namespace? What happens as I federate? That's the next concern I think that comes up.
Yeah, so it sticks around, and we show in the blog post here, right? So every Nutanix cluster running the object service includes the object browser, right? Which is not the only way you can manage it. Of course, you can get there with any S3 client, but we also do include one natively that runs right there in your browser. And as part of that, you can browse the local namespace, which doesn't go away, or the parts of it that also are holding federated resources as well. So it sort of becomes, I almost genuinely and non-ironically said a prism to not to be on brand, but to show that it can show like multiple facets of what's going on there, right? The local and the remote. Maybe it's more like a split telescope. I think Prism actually is close enough to being on brand.
Well, that's good. And it also says any of the existing data is going to stay. So it's non-disruptive to federate, which is also a great thing. It's not like you destroy anything as you adopt federation.
Philip, your DFS analogy is getting frustratingly more and more useful the more we go on. Probably most frustrating to people that are more like S3 purists. I can get to the share through the local file server, or of course through the DFS again, namespace, right? Like it's more like logical traffic routing than it is hard plumbing, right? So to your point, yeah, of course, like no data churn as a result of the federation, unless I configure it, right? Like migration or replication.
Yeah. And what's great in the article here, we've got good screenshots, which of course listeners can't hear. But if you happen to be watching on YouTube, you see it on screen. You've got different tabs associated with the type of namespace, whether it's local or a federation that you're participating in. And it looks like here we can actually participate in multiple federations. Is that true as well?
Sure can, yeah. So the federation is this is the sound of me thinking out loud. It's like a user definable grouping, right? So like there's no requirement that like just because it runs the objects service on one Nutanix cluster that it has to be in all federations or none. Like I can pick and choose. I want this object store to be part of that one, but I can deploy another object store that's part of a different federation as well. I can think of use cases for that even for use cases, right? Like backup versus CDN, cloud native application storage and retrieval, or also stuff like even like multi-tenant, right? Like I can have tenant federation 1, tenant federation 2, and those are fully separate, placements of data.
So Ben, as you're listening to this, what questions do you have? I mean, what do you think customers are going to be asking about?
So, I mean, the separate federation things kind of got me interested in a sense. And I'm thinking of this mainly from mergers and acquisitions. So if I had started out with a parent federation, but I had to bring another federation on in an M&A situation, you lost me a little bit of like, how would it be 2 federation zones going to the same storage? Kind of explain that a little better to me. I'm a little lost with that concept there.
So could be either one really, Ben, right? So we should caveat that we're talking about Nutanix governed S3, right?
Yes.
There was ways you could certainly ingest data from like any other S3, whether that's public cloud or any other kind of on-prem S3 solution. But yeah, to your point, we certainly can use federations for like a data migration use case, right? So that the object store can live elsewhere, but then we bring it more into the family, right, for governance reasons.
Yeah.
And it looks like you've thought a couple steps ahead. I mean, migrations, federation with fault tolerance and migration is also capability. I mean, I think the underlying thing is there's a lot of things to think about as federation came to life. Talk us through a little bit of fault tolerance and migration use cases.
Yeah. So when I've talked to customers about this in the past, there's been that desire. And some of this we solved for earlier, even before federation, but some things get even easier with federation in play now. Of like, great, if I have my LA and New York data centers, and I can have the same data in each one, or I want to have the same data in each one, and I want to lose power to one site or lose my WAN link to one of these data centers, and everything just keeps on working, right? And then with that, like we talked about before, like a GSLB or a DNS based direction, because I can also do it without GSLB if I just simply want to sort of micromanage my DNS records at every site. If I'm running site-aware DNS servers, that can work as well. I can now say, hey, the same data is in LA or New York, go to either data center, right? Or go to whichever one is closer to you or whichever one's alive. So now I've gained site fault tolerance for that data set, for that application, for that use case. Like Ben touched on, I could have a federation that includes LA and New York, and a bucket starts life off in one or the other. But then we actually decide that, hey, this is a very, very latency sensitive application. Move that bucket to the other one, right, where maybe the application is running. So moving within a federation or moving across federation, right? I can move from, like say, that local namespace into a federated namespace, right? Saying this used to be site local and by design, but now we want to make it actually more available as part of the federation as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. We keep talking about the global server load balancing. The next section actually talks specifically about that with geo-distributed. Is this a third-party GSLB that we're kind of talking about? And so it's a separate appliance or application, NetScaler, I can't even think, F5.
Definitely, those are the big two, right? And NetScaler F5. I mean, you could probably write it yourself with Nginx, with a whole bunch of native web scaler, web server scaling technology. But certainly your turnkey off the shelf commercial solutions would be stuff like NetScaler, stuff like F5. But yeah, all of that. So that is the mostly client facing load balancing. That says like when I want to go to, objectsfederation01.contoso.com, like where is that thing? And it knows where those things are, and it directs you to the closest location for that. Or if one site's down, it directs you to a surviving site, right? So that you still get service there. There are, and we have a caveat here in the article, that there are some layers of load balancing, specifically we use like Envoy, closer to the metal, right? So like everything we do at Nutanix, this runs as a virtual machine, runs as a VM. And so fundamentally, if you pop the hood, Objects is a service that runs on one or more Prism element clusters, right? The cluster is literally just a collection of nodes that do compute for virtual machines as well as storage, as multiple VMs, right? I think your default sort of like run-of-the-mill, out-of-the-box Objects deployment is like, I think it's 4 worker VMs and 2 load balancing VMs last I looked. So there are some load balancers you'll see like -LB in the VM name that's going to run Envoy, but that's doing load balancing for us, right? Oh, which VM is governing this vdisk or this data store or this data placement? That's at a lower level than the customer facing, and to your point, Philip, customer provided GSLB fabric.
Yeah, so I think that's a huge distinction to make. Nutanix is providing everything that's needed under the covers. The customer needs to bring their own global server load balancing for client-facing activities. So,
or DNS, and likewise bring their own DNS server as well.
Yeah, DNS, and you're right. I mean, yeah. So we get into situations with DNS. I mean, you can do simple round robin, but that's not really intelligent. And so bringing intelligence to the conversation, a GSLB, which is going to route users to the closest geographic region, really becomes advantageous to customers. And I would suspect most customers of the scale who are enterprise customers that really want to take care of this or take advantage of this federation, they're probably already going to have something in their portfolio to be able to provide it. And if not, I mean, Azure, AWS, there are great GSLB solutions and cloud providers as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can even picture a way to get here with using like Active Directory zones and site-aware records. And I can picture that quickly turning into an argument for buying GSLBs as well. There's things you can do, and there's things that you actually want to actually own as the full solution.
Yeah, there's things you can do and things you should do.
Yeah.
Jirah, I know this is still fairly new for our portfolio, but have we had any clients use this in a sense of differentiating between on-prem and cloud S3 buckets? We've seen
great question, Ben. So, and to be super clear for our listeners, right? So, Objects itself is going from memory here, 4.5, 5 years old. It's actually like super mature as an on-prem, like Nutanix owned and managed. Like this is version 4.0 that we're kind of highlighting here and some of the features. So the federation is the new part, right? But Nutanix as an S3 object data store, actually kind of not so new, really, but still, I mean, amazing question, Ben. So like, yeah, for sure. I mean, it's really part of when we say that Nutanix is a cloud platform, right? And I don't say public or private anymore. It's all, of course, hybrid multi-cloud because it's your cloud that goes wherever you want to run your business, whether that's own or rent or your building or colo or partner data center or XenTegra data center or public cloud or anything. Like it's your cloud, man. Like where do you want your cloud to be? And does your cloud need to be scalable and rented, or is it pretty static and owned, or all these things? But from a capability standpoint of what does your cloud probably need to have to support even today's apps like backup and tomorrow's apps like cloud native and containerized applications, S3 as a protocol is sort of like something that you probably as a cloud provider to your business, which is sort of like my thought technology for like how you need to own and run IT as a company. If you're a customer, right, is like I am a cloud provider to the business that can involve, I integrate all these vendors and I can choose to make public cloud or private cloud or any of that a component of that. Like S3's just got to be there probably, right? Because your developers, if they're developing apps, probably on a long enough timeline are going to want to see this kind of capability, this kind of storage. Even your other vendors, right? Like I've highlighted them here, like at least, and probably not limited to, like your Rubrics, Cohesities, Commvaults, Veeams, want to speak S3 somewhere. So it just kind of becomes more and more of a closer and closer to mandatory offering that you have to have. Same way, similarly, like 30 years ago, was like, do you offer DNS? Right? Maybe you said no, right? No, we do all, I don't know, NetBUI, but like eventually you got to a point where you said, yes, we offer DNS. And so now it's like, do you offer S3? And that's becoming more and more of a yes elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems to be the de facto object store language. I mean, I know Microsoft's got their own version of Azure Blob, but almost everyone talks S3. I mean, it's the most widely adopted. And to your point, Jirah, I mean, I used scale out backup repositories inside of Veeam. We were sending data out to an S3 storage provider, and it worked extraordinarily well for offsite immutable backups. And in the latest version, they can back up Veeam can back up directly to S3 storage. So it makes a Nutanix cluster running Nutanix objects a viable backup target. So it opens new avenues without adding additional operational complexity and things like that. You could, do an entire backup-based Nutanix cluster to the side, or possibly a lower tier archive along with your backup storage. So I think the opportunities are huge for customers as they look at the landscape, which is changing over the last few years.
Yeah. And to your point, Philip, and to your question, Ben, like, why would I look at Nutanix for that? Because we're, candidly, we're not like a household name yet as a backup target, right? Nutanix is not commonly thought of that way. I don't see customers, coming to me and saying, hey, giving an unsolicited proposal for a backup cluster. It's a thing we can do, but we're still getting the word out there about that. But why would I want to? We've highlighted the operational, like, sort of lifecycle difference is like running a Nutanix backup cluster is as easy as running any other Nutanix cluster, which is super, super easy, both on day 1 and day 1500 when you want to refresh it. But also I see proposals all the time that have, competitive financial comparisons against like public cloud S3 storage, where we're saving the customer maybe 30 to 50% against cloud storage. So better price per pound for these, quote, cheap and deep workloads. But also no egress charge, right? Like this can be a cluster that lives next to your backup appliance or your production cluster. But I can get to that data for free versus being like, oh, I don't want to do a big restore out of the cloud because I'm going to get hit with that cloud bill for the cloud egress charge for the month. So pretty differentiated solution there.
And there are alternatives or competitors, I guess I should say, competitors to AWS who obviously invented S3, created S3. There are whole businesses that exist trying to solve that same problem of egress charges, as cloud providers. You can do one better by getting it into the same data center or into other colos for further savings, where you're doing the management instead of paying a cloud provider to manage your S3 storage. Well, guys, I think this was an amazing topic and amazing session for us today. I know I learned a lot. Ben, anything sticking out for you?
Oh yeah, man. Just again, the Nutanix Unified Storage Systems are a great story for our company. Man, I need to learn more about it because it is somewhere that is another arsenal in my toolbox to present to clients. But appreciate you letting me join today. Definitely learned a lot about the federation process of this, and excited to get out and ask some questions to my customers to see how this would be useful for them.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think this is some of the exciting stuff Nutanix is definitely delivering. So it's great. Jirah, really appreciate you unpacking this and bringing the topic forward for us today.
My pleasure, man. Thank you all for the time. Thank you to my buddy Steve here for writing such an excellent blog post as well.
Yeah, Steve, kudos, man. This was very interesting and really cool stuff. So kudos to the entire Nutanix team bringing this stuff to light. On behalf of XenTegra, Jirah, and Ben, I want to say thank you for carving out a little time and listening to our podcast today. We will certainly be back with more, and hope you'll join us for a future podcast episode. Until then, I'm Phil Sellers for XenTegra, and we'll catch you next time.